Good afternoon to you all. This is Irfan Ibrahim calling from the CITER office in Reston, Virginia. We are very pleased to have Mike Murillo present a future vision of a utility. We are presenting this as part of the Smart Grid Educational Series monthly webinar for June of 2013. Just to provide you some background on this presentation, Mike, many of you know, has been in the industry for many years and has provided not only his technical input, but also has contributed to the journalistic aspect of the industry for many years. His latest contribution is this Utility Horizons magazine, and he'll talk more about that in the presentation. But it is a very novel way of looking at the electric sector and bringing some very unique perspectives from various stakeholders. And I highly recommend that you look at this magazine, this online magazine, and read the thought-provoking articles. One of the areas that is very near and dear to my heart, and Mike shares this view, is that the smart grid is just a part of a much larger reformation or change that is coming into the electric sector. And that instead of just looking at incremental improvements in infrastructure and business process and in policy, that we rethink how the electric sector should operate going forward. And having that new way of thinking would mean that many new technologies, new business processes, and new policies would come in a completely different paradigm. A paradigm where the customer is no longer seen as a load, but as an effective contributor of electricity as well as ancillary services to the grid, where independent power producers are going to become increasingly a larger and larger part of the energy mix, and they need to find a place in this sector. And then also for the utility companies, both transmission companies and distribution companies, to find a place where they can deliver electricity reliably, safely, securely at a price point that creates a profit margin for them, because after all, for a majority of them are in the private sector and they have to answer to their shareholders. So in this environment, pluralistic environment, we have to really think very deeply and widely about how the electric sector should look going forward. What is the role of a utility? What is the role of a regulator? How should vendors participate in this environment? All of these questions come up. So just taking an incremental approach to where we are today, or looking back and looking at the experience we've had, does not give us the tools to forecast the future. We really have to come together and build a consensus on a vision of what the utility of the future should look like, and all the participants who will collaborate with that utility of the future. So with that as the backdrop, I would like to invite Mike Murillo at this point, and I will move the presenter ball to him so that he can start his presentation and share his knowledge with us. So Mike, the ball is in your court.
Thank you, Irfan, and thank you all for attending today's session. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which time zone you're tuned in from. Just for general information, I'm in New Orleans, which is in the U.S. Central Time Zone, so middle of the day here. And as Irfan mentioned, I mean, we've been acquainted for some time now. I think we met originally at Grid Week a few years ago when Irfan was engaged in bringing together what's now commonly referred to as the standard of standards, of bringing all the standards for smart grid under one umbrella through NIST and DOE and so forth. So over the past couple of years, we've had numerous conversations, and as he mentioned, one of the things that we agree on is that there is definitely not only a role, but a changing role for media as it pertains to the not just smart grid, but to really the whole evolution of the utility automation and IT industry. So my presentation today is going to cover actually all three market verticals that are covered by the magazine, as well as an event called the Utility Horizons Symposium that I'll tell you a little bit about as well. And the Utility Horizons portal has information about both of these initiatives. But we're focused, like I said, on the electric, gas, and water utility sector on a global level, and we'll get back to that in a minute. I wanted to start here with some information about my background, and this is not to be boastful in any way, but I've had a very diverse career over the past 42 years or so that I wanted to share with you, just to give those of you that don't know me a perspective on kind of where I'm coming from on all of this. First of all, I want to just run through the agenda very quickly. Once we get through the background experience, it's just a few slides. I'm not going to dwell on those. We'll go through those quickly. But I want to talk about the new role of media in what amounts to a transitional marketplace. And we're going to talk a lot about change and transition and transformation, particularly media's traditional versus what I call the transitional role and responsibilities. The tagline for the Utility Horizons portal that we chose when this initiative was launched back in the middle of last year is Automation Rising. And we chose that because we're in the midst of what we perceive to be a renaissance of sorts, and I'll talk a little bit more also about what that means and where we see the future of the utility industry from an automation IT standpoint. Irfan mentioned the utility of the future model, and key to the model, we've heard about utility of the future, quote unquote, for, I don't know, probably 4, 5, 6 years now. It's been kicked around. Until now, I really, in fact, when I first heard that term, I thought, yeah, blah, blah, blah. It sounds, it's a nice buzzword to kick around, but nobody really hung a lot of flesh on the bones of what that really meant until fairly recently. And what we've really zeroed in on here is that education and innovation are really the dual cornerstones of what the utility of the future is going to be all about. And more specifically, the challenge that we face, or that utilities are facing on becoming a utility of the future and reinventing or transforming themselves into what utilities really need to look like in the 21st century, is really based on the notion of balancing human capital with infrastructure optimization. So we're going to talk a bit about the role that automation IT plays in that transition and that transformation. And then at the end, I'll just go over the magazine and the symposium with you briefly, just to give you a flavor for what we're doing here. The magazine launched in the 4th quarter of last year, and the symposium will be launched, the first event will be in January of next year, and I'll go through that with you a bit as well. So in terms of background, I started my career actually in an engineering agency in the U.S. Air Force back in the 60s, so I'm an old guy. My first job out of the military, I came out of the military with a radar and RF communications background. Went to work for General Dynamics in Rochester, New York, which is where I'm from originally. Haven't lived there in 42 years, but that's where my roots are. Went to work for General Dynamics working on the F-111 fighter bomber avionics systems. And coming out of the Air Force with an RF communications background, and when I went for my interview, they had this multi-million-dollar microwave lab, so I thought, wow, this is going to be great. Well, lo and behold, I wound up in the DC circuits group, which I knew nothing about. So it was a learning experience, and as it turns out, that proved to be sort of the hallmark of my entire career, is switching gears every few years, at least the beginning, into different areas. They ultimately shut down that division. I was transferred into what at the time was a subsidiary of General Dynamics called Stromberg Carlson. Stromberg was at the time, the largest independent manufacturer of telephone equipment in the United States after Western Electric, which at that time was part of the Bell companies, AT&T and so forth. So the first thing that happened there is I come out of General Dynamics with a DC circuits background, and they immediately put me into digital PBX systems and read switching systems and so forth, which again I knew nothing about. So the first thing I did was go back to school on learning the basics of telephony and digital switches. Those switches, by the way, were being developed and were eventually installed in Walt Disney World for the grand opening of the park in 1969. From there, after spending a couple of years back in Rochester, after spending my military time mostly in the South, I remembered why I left. I arrived back in Rochester when I was discharged in the middle of a blizzard, and remembered that that wasn't the kind of weather I wanted to deal with. So ultimately, I wound up getting a job at a company here in New Orleans called Tano Corporation, where I worked for about 8 years, and I was primarily involved in offshore and onshore oil and gas pipeline and production automation systems, mainly SCADA and RTU systems. From there, I went to another company, and at that company, I got involved with factory floor automation systems, or what we commonly refer to today as MES, or manufacturing execution systems, mainly for large automotive and industrial customers like Caterpillar and General Motors and Ford and Chrysler. A few years later, I reconnected with some of my former colleagues from Tano. We had all left at different times. We formed a company called Quantum Systems in 1980, which was involved with energy and utility SCADA and RTU systems. We're proud of the fact that we created the first single board RTU in 1980 and also the first 32-bit SCADA kernel in 1982, both of which are still in use today. I've always had I guess you might say, a flair for technical writing. I've done a lot of presentations, a lot of technical papers, written more proposals than I even want to think about during my days of engineering and sales. But in 1995, I became the managing editor for the launch of Utility Automation, which is now what's called Power Grid International. It's a Penwell publication. And for 2 years after that, I was a newsletter editor, and this was all on a contract basis. I've never actually worked directly for a publishing company. In 2006, I joined Jaguar Media, again on a contract basis. In 2006 was really my first direct involvement with putting on a conference, North American T&D Conference 2006. And then I also became the chairman of the Smart Grid Roadshow that many are probably familiar with. I chaired 8 events for that and was also the editor-in-chief of Electric Energy T&D magazine for 4.5 years. So that was really the background of my editorial and publishing experience. In the middle of last year, I decided that the industry needed something new. Hadn't made any changes in a while, so I decided to launch a new publication called Utility Horizons Quarterly. And as I mentioned, that was launched in the 4th quarter of last year. And just this week, some of you may even have received emails today announcing the availability of the Q2 edition of the magazine, which is now available online. Talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but basically we're the only all-digital magazine in the industry. The Utility Horizons Symposium is very closely linked with the magazine in terms of mission and vision, and again, we'll talk about that more. I have 2 operating companies that I own. One is CFAR International, which is actually sort of I hesitate to say the parent company because Utility Horizons is not a company, it's a business unit of CFAR. And then my other company is Infinetrics, that some of you may also be familiar with, which is a market research and consulting company. Been in business since 2002, and we survey utilities and ask them about their plans for automation IT across the entire utility enterprise. This is just some additional information about CFAR and Infinetrics. CFAR stands for Centers for Automation Resources. It was incorporated in 1996, and Infinetrics has been around, was launched actually at the IEEE T&D conference in Atlanta in 2002. So now the role of media, and again, I've been doing this for 20 years or so now. As I look out over the various publications that are out there, one of the things that I noticed when I decided to do this was I was going to go back to doing to really creating a research-based house organ, if you will. I knew I didn't want to do another newsletter. There's already too many newsletters in the smart grid space. So I wanted to do something with a little bit more meat on it, and what my original thought was to have a research-based newsletter drawing upon the substantial amount of research that we create every day, every month, and every year through Infometrics. We survey about 400 to 600 utilities a year across North America, and we, analyze and report on where the market is headed from that standpoint. But when I started looking at how I was going to disseminate this publication that I was thinking of doing, and I started looking at e-publishing engines, I realized that there were a lot of things that you could do with digital publishing that nobody was doing. And we all know that just about every publication nowadays, with maybe very few exceptions, has at least a digital version. Well, there's a lot of differences, it turns out, between a digital version of a publication and a digital magazine or a digital publication. And we'll go into that in a little more detail later. But basically, it allows you to do things that were never able to be done before, and it's not really something you can do with a digital version. A lot of the things, anyway, are not features and aspects and dimensions that can be replicated in a digital version of a print publication, for the simple reason that as you start making changes in the digital version, then you wind up running two magazines, and nobody can afford to do that. But media has had a traditional role, and Irfan and I have had a couple of discussions about, what we've talked about, responsible journalism. Responsible journalism, and this is not like an industry classification, this is sort of my definition, but it's a requirement to identify and publish information that's based on truths and facts that are obtained from reliable and trustworthy sources. That kind of applies to all of media, whether it's consumer or industrial or commercial or B2B or B2C, whatever it happens to be. But it's particularly important in technical markets where technical accuracy and specificity is especially important. And then the second thing is to report news and information in a clear and unbiased way that separates facts and observations, hopefully, from perceptions and opinions. And I think we can all agree that the media today, at least the national and the global media, has stepped way over the line in terms of confusing news with opinions and editorial, and even in some cases entertainment. So this is something I guess you might say I'm old school about. I reject the notion that our media in this part of the marketplace should become more entertaining or more sensational, and unfortunately we've seen some of that. But what Irfan and I have kind of settled on is that what needs to happen from the standpoint of media playing a transitional role, and again, I think we can all agree that our industry is definitely in transition and transformation. And during this transitional period, the role of media becomes even more important. And what that means is that the slightest indiscretion, mistake, variation, deliberate or otherwise, from what's really going on, happens to do the industry very often a disservice. So we've talked about this notion of deliberate journalism. In other words, there's a difference between writing about something because it's something to write about and because somebody gave you a storyline to develop, versus developing a story or an editorial around delivering clear, concise, very specific information about what's going on in the marketplace. Because the role of the media's role is a pretty significant one from the standpoint that media has the ability to steer markets. So it's a very onerous responsibility, and it's one that we feel needs to be carried out very carefully, and particularly, again, from a technical reporting standpoint, by recognizing the need for technically accurate terminology and resisting the temptation to, publish sensational headlines or things that are knowingly controversial just for the sake of being controversial. I'm not saying that I have a problem with publishing what's actually going on in the industry, but I'll give you a case in point that I've talked about and written about quite a bit, is the notion a lot of people have, and they have it fairly because this is the way it's been presented by the media, is that the terms smart grid and smart metering are interchangeable. They absolutely are not, and unfortunately now that there's been a lot written over the years about the hype cycle with smart grid and smart metering, and I think, again, there's been too much hype and too little substance, I think, in general over the past few years. But the good news is that starting at the beginning of this year, and maybe this coincides with the downside slope of the stimulus money, at least in North America, kind of winding down, the hype on smart metering really seems to be subsiding, and I'm very happy to say that I think all of the major smart meter providers, smart metering providers, the AMI providers, as well as the consultants and so forth, really now seem to be focused in on understanding that smart grid and smart metering are two different things, and that smart grid, is a much broader picture. So I think we're getting that sorted out. So what does all this have to do with automation in the broader sense, and why did we choose this tagline of automation rising? Well, it's interesting because in all the years that I've been involved in this industry, I've always felt that automation was being grossly underutilized, and I believe that it still is today. And what's happened over the last few years, no amount of deliberate promotion or advertising or skilled selling or anything could have caused the kind of transition and the transformation that we're seeing from the standpoint of automation right now by any other means. The market is kind of taking care of the problem on its own. And the two biggest factors that are driving this renaissance in automation is aging workforce, number one, the fact that about 10,000 boomers are retiring every day. This started at the beginning of 2010 and will continue for the next 2 decades. And to a large degree, this is one of those cases of unintended consequences. I think because utilities have had a much higher degree of stability in their workforce than most other industries have had, a high degree of loyalty, high degree of people with lots of tenure. Utilities are among the hardest hit with the aging workforce problems, at least in developed countries, where we have this wave of boomers moving through that are all now reaching retirement age. And I'm sure you've seen the statistics, something like 62% or something of all the most senior people in the utility industry are going to retire by 2015, or at least be eligible for retirement. They'll be of the age of retirement, will hit 65. The other thing that goes hand in hand with this, which is equally problematic and creates a huge challenge for every utility in every part of the country, every geography, every size, type, you name it, is that the infrastructure that we've created and installed over the last 50 years is all reaching the end of its, and I always put statistically projected useful life, because it's not like you put something in that has a useful life of 35 years and 35 years later it just goes to sleep and dies. It usually doesn't work that way. That works that way for car batteries, by the way. If you buy a 24-month car battery, at least my experience has been that on 24 months and a day, it's going to go bad. So you buy a 36-month and it goes bad in 36 months and a day. They got that science down, but not so in the utility industry. But by and large, if you look across the utility landscape, what you will see is that there is a very substantial portion of our infrastructure that is, as a friend of mine, a consultant friend of mine says, on the backside of the bathtub curve. In other words, if you turn a bathtub upside down, it looks like a sine wave. And we're now on the declining side. So most of what's out there, a huge portion of it, is 35 to 50 years old, which means that it needs to be either upgraded, enhanced, repaired, or replaced. There's not enough money in the world to replace or even repair everything out there that needs upgrading and other attention that turns into dollars. So what do we do about this? Well, before we get to the solution, mention a couple of other problems that are not on the horizon, they're with us already. One of those is security, and utilities are among the most critical parts of our infrastructure, and because of that, they're also among the most frequently hacked and attacked. Utilities are being attacked every single day of every month of every year, to the tune of some utilities are reporting tens of thousands of attacks per month, some even higher than that. So the need to protect our infrastructure, our critical infrastructure around utilities, has never been more critical than it is now. And then the fourth and final element that's really having the biggest impact on the marketplace is service reliability and the expectations of consumers. So here we are, and kind of what I refer to as on the next slide here as the perfect storm. If you take the aging workforce issue with everybody that's mainstream in the industry retiring, at the same time that the infrastructure is on the backside of its decline, and then you couple that with security vulnerability and service reliability expectations, consumers think that service should be better than it's ever been, and reliability should be better than it's ever been. And by the way, they think they should be able to do that at certainly not any more than the rates they're paying today, and ideally less. The answer to that equation is up for grabs, but I think, you know, we can all say that meeting these challenges is not going to be an easy fix, a quick fix, and it's certainly not going to be cheap or inexpensive. So we need new solutions, and they're not going to be found by looking back to see what we did the last time this happened, because there is no last time for this. We've never been in a situation before where the entire utility industry staff is retiring, the infrastructure is declining, security is threatening, and reliability expectations are rising. So if the example I like to give about what I call the case history mindset of utilities is that if you talk to 10 utility people on the street and said, hey, what would you like to read about, or what would you like to hear about at a conference, probably 10 out of 10 of those people would say something like, well, what I'd like to know is I'd like to know what other utilities that are like mine are doing, what they did, how they did it, who they did it with, what worked, what didn't work, and what they do different the next time. What that amounts to is basically what I call a case history mindset or a case history mentality. In other words, let's look back at the last time that we did this, or at least the last time somebody else did it, and let's see what they did. A lot of the challenges that we're facing today, in fact, all of these challenges that are listed here in this perfect storm analogy are new. This is not something that we've dealt with before. So we have the firm belief at Infinetrix and Utility Horizons that we will not solve this problem by looking back in history to see what we should do going forward. Something else that I'd like to point out here was at the Distributech conference earlier this year in San Diego in January. Michael Nigley, who is the CEO of San Diego Gas and Electric, part of Sempra Energy, gave the keynote there. I didn't attend the keynote because I was doing other things, as many of us were. But when I went around to the exhibit floor, I started talking with some of our clients and other people that were at the conference, and I mentioned that we were the introduction of Utility Horizons. At that time, we had just published our debut issue. So, you know, I was there talking it around and, you know, bringing people up to speed on what we were doing and where we were headed with it. And at least 3 or 4 of the people that I spoke to totally independently, when I told them about the need to look forward, they said, oh, you must have listened to Michael Nigley's talk this morning. And I said, no. I said, unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there. And I said, why do you say that? And they said, well, and I listened, by the way, in our last issue, in the Q1 issue, we have a clip from his speech in the publisher's message, which is a good illustration of one of the things you can do with digital media that you can't do with print. But it also has a link to the full YouTube video of his presentation if anybody wants to listen to it. But what isn't in there was apparently some comments that he made in the Q&A that followed. What he said, to paraphrase, was that he said, if you're a supplier to my utility, don't come in and tell me what you did for me yesterday or last week or last month or last year. I need to know what you're going to do for me 5 years from now. That's a pretty radical departure from the what did you do the last time, how did you do it, who did you do it with, what worked and what didn't, the case history mentality. Michael Nigley is, I would say, not representative of the mainstream of the utility market, but if we're really going to get to the utility of the future, people like Mike Nigley at San Diego Gas and Electric, Jim Rogers at Duke Energy, and a number of other C-level executives at utilities around the country, not just in investor-owned utilities, but even and especially in some cases, some of the municipal utilities and even the rural electric co-ops, the light has come on, to coin a phrase. They've realized that they have to look forward to move forward. So these are the hallmarks of a marketplace in transition, and that's what Utility Horizons is really here to help support. Just some general thoughts about, okay, so what is the utility of the future? What does it need to be? How does it need to look? It needs to be a lot more agile. Utilities are not known for being very dynamic organizations or acting quickly. They need to be more flexible in terms of, I mean, the best example there is the integration of renewables is not like some idea that might or might not happen. It's happening as we speak. It's been happening for a while now. it really represents a fundamentally different way of doing business for utilities because they're used to the centralized baseload generation and a distributed power delivery network with generation and power sources being injected all along the network. That's a completely different model from what most utilities are accustomed to and what they've dealt with for nearly 100 years, over 100 years actually. They need to be forward-facing. Again, the utility mindset of looking backward to go forward is something that's instilled in utilities. This is perhaps, you might look at this as a part of a silver lining to retiring boomers, which is my generation, so I can be as candid as I want. We have a tendency to be set in our ways. We have a tendency to think that the way we did things is the only way to do things. Excuse me, and we're on a path now that requires everybody at a utility to at least have a forward-facing posture. It doesn't mean you can never look back to see what worked and what didn't, but the paradigm of how you decide what to do next really needs to change. Naturally, utility people need to be more technologically savvy than ever, and that's one part where what I call the newbies, the people that are coming in to take the place of the retiring veteran staffers, they're very technologically savvy. They, unlike the boomer generation, they literally grew up with technology, with advanced technology. So it's not so much a matter with them of whether they're going to accept it. It's more like they expect it. And I know from speaking with them and looking at our survey data and so forth, I can tell you that a lot of them, I think, are probably sort of shocked / disappointed that there isn't more being done. So that's one of the big ingredients, I think, in this automation renaissance. They also need to be broadly educated. We have a lot of specialists in this industry, and because of the fact that from the earliest days of utility automation or utility operation even, if you look across the utility enterprise and turn the clock back even 25 years or even 5 years at this point, most utilities have done their budgeting traditionally on what I call a compartmentalized basis. In other words, one year you look at SCADA, the next year you look at CIS, then you look at GIS, then you look at outage management, then you look at whatever, and then after several years, the merry-go-round comes back around and you hope you can grab the brass ring, and then everybody wonders why nothing talks to anything. Well, that paradigm is changing, and has been driven extensively by the AMI movement and smart metering because, quite frankly, that operation, that portion of utility operations soaks up so much money that for the first time, utilities are really forced to look at their entire automation IT expenditures on a more holistic basis. Now, in the meantime, the supplier community has done a stellar job of embracing standards, providing off-the-shelf, commercial off-the-shelf hardware and software, shrink-wrapped programs and so forth, standards from, national as well as global. They've done a really great job of dealing with the interoperability demands and the standardization demands of the industry. The thing is that most utilities still have not come around to budgeting that way. That's changing. And as I said, AMI has played a really positive role in forcing that to happen. But when I say broadly educated, what this means is that everybody's going to have to get out of their comfort zone now, because it's not good enough to say, well, I'm a metering guy, or I'm a SCADA guy, or I'm an RTU guy, or I'm a CIS guy or gal. I don't want to be sexist here, but the bottom line is that you have to know at least a little about a lot to really be effective in a utility these days, and especially in the future. And what all this comes down to is that you really have to be ready and even anxious to embrace change, because change is coming, and that sounds like a trite statement that probably is like, duh, everybody knows that, but I think it's worth repeating often, because people need to remember that we are in a period of change, and accommodating that change rather than fighting it is what's going to get us to the next level and to be the utility of the future. I want to take a few minutes here to talk about education and innovation and the role that these two critical elements play in our industry. And the characterization is what I call the newbies. These are the people that are taking the place of the retiring industry seniors, if you will. And they're characterized, they're very smart, they're well educated, they're very tech savvy, they're certainly trainable, and they're motivated to learn. But what we hear when we talk to these people that are taking the place in our Infometrics research, we talk to the utility people that have project responsibility. We not only occasionally, we are routinely finding people who are in charge of projects, pick any category you want, that have never done a project like that before, and they don't really know the rudiments. They don't know who's in the business. They don't know how much the stuff costs, even though they're expected to provide a budget for it. They're provided to put together a bid list, but they don't know who the suppliers are to that part of the industry. And the reason is, and I'll just digress here for just a moment because I think it's a little side piece that's important to put all of this, what's going on in the industry in perspective, and the big hiccup really that's, I think, causing a lot of the pain in terms of migrating to the utility of the future. Back about, well, almost 30 years ago now, but back in the early 1980s, we began what's commonly referred to as the downsizing, or some of you may know it as the right-sizing era. This is when industry in general, not just energy and utilities, but all industry, said, you know, we got too much fat in the organizations, we need to flatten the organizations, we need to get rid of all these extra people that we've got here and really slim down and streamline. Well, what happened was, the first thing that happened was that anybody who was around the early 1980s knows that just about everybody in the company lost their secretary or their executive assistant or admin. That was the first wave, but that was only the beginning. The next thing that utilities in particular started doing is they started looking at what I call the bench. In other words, the people that were coming along behind the people that were the senior people back in the early 1980s. And they said, you know, we don't really need all these extra people, just like we don't need all these extra transformers in the warehouse. We need to get lean and mean. We need to start looking at this more like a business and really being accountable. So we're going to get rid of a lot of those people. So what happened during that period is the people that would have been what I'll call the journeyman level, if you will, the people who would have been coming as the next class behind the seniors that we have now, a lot of those people got squeezed out. They either got packages in the form of early retirements or they just were outright laid off, downsized, right-sized, whatever you want to call it. So those people went away. And this downsizing and right-sizing period lasted for about a decade, from the early 80s to the early 90s. The final ingredient in that whole process, that decade-long process that really is hurting us now, is that while utilities are busy downsizing and right-sizing and getting rid of people, they also really didn't hire anybody during that period. There was sort of a de facto hiring freeze. So when you're in the process of getting rid of people, you don't turn around and rehire people. So what do we have? We have the people that were the seniors then, or the seniors now, the people who were coming along right behind them that would have had 5 to 10 years less experience got squeezed out, and the people that would have been behind them with another 5 to 10 years of less experience never got hired in the first place. So you fast forward 30 years, here we are in 2013, and the people that really should be there to take the place of these retiring veterans are simply not there. And the ones that should have been behind them are not there. So we have a serious deficit of experienced people that are being expected to take over the mainstream of utility operations. Good news is automation can do a lot of that kind of thing, and as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, I've always been sort of a cheerleader for automation and felt like it was underutilized. Well, now we've reached a point where it's not only a good idea, it's kind of the only idea. It's the only solution. So on the senior people side, people on the senior side are not looking so much for education. They're smart, they're experienced, they're disciplined, they're insightful. They're looking for solutions. The people that are still at the senior levels in utilities and will continue to be there for some time, what they really need to know is what Michael Nigley wants to know. I want to know what you're going to do for me a month, a year, 5 years from now. So again, this is a big part of what we're trying to provide both in the magazine and we talk about the symposium here a little bit later, where we're going with this, and we're trying to provide a journalistic component, I guess, to guide people on where the industry is headed. One result of that is that Utility Horizons Quarterly Magazine in all of my previous activities as a journalist, as an editor, as a writer, and so forth, the goal has typically always been, oh, you got to find a utility author or a utility co-author to be able to talk about this stuff. Because of this complete shift that we've had here of needing to look forward, in many cases far forward, there's many cases where new products, services, systems, and so forth simply don't have customers yet. Again, here the example I like to use is energy storage. Everybody knows that energy storage is going to happen. We've already seen a number of examples of different ways to do it. Nothing has pulled out yet as the runaway leader or anything, but everybody knows this is an absolute essential, because for renewables to really live up to their expectations and be able to extract the maximum value from renewables integration, we really need to have a way to store energy so we can use it when it's needed and not just on the fly when it happens to be happening, whether it's solar, wind, geothermal, what have you. So our editorial focus in Utility Horizons is to report on what happens, what's coming next, future focused, future facing. We've had 4 quarterly issues so far, as I said. For this year, the first issue was focused on across the boards on electric, gas, and water. Every issue has electric, gas, and water automation IT content. We don't have special issues that are exclusively one market vertical. However, we do have an emphasis in each issue this year. The Q1 issue, which is the one that shows plan, respond, restore here, that was our electric utility emphasis issue. The second quarter, which was just published, focuses on the water sector. But again, all of these issues have articles, and we welcome articles in all 3 of the market verticals. The one coming up in Q3 will be our gas issue, and then in the fourth quarter, our fourth quarter issue will go back out and actually be our Utility Horizons Symposium program issue. This education innovation, you're going to probably feel is a little redundant here, but it is a recurring theme deliberately, because what's really needed in the industry right now is, from an education standpoint, the newbies need that practical and pragmatic learning resource. But some veterans, for example, I mean, you may be somebody who's done, a half dozen different GIS projects, let's say, and all of a sudden, your utility reorganizes, you have a new job responsibility, and now you're expected to do a SCADA system or an outage management system. So the learning is not limited. The need for learning and education is by no means limited to just the newcomers, but that's certainly where the emphasis is. But even a lot of the veterans that have been around a long time, there's also a need in some cases, and this gets back to what I was saying about the holistic view of automation IT across the utility enterprise. As more and more utilities move to that model, which they inevitably will at this point, there's going to be this need for broader knowledge and broader access. The innovation piece is, again, something that, the insights and knowledge and information about what's coming is what we believe is needed, and that's what we're focused on as a publication. Our content in Utility Horizons Quarterly is 100% automation IT in every issue. In other words, no work gloves or work boots or cable or wires or transformers, unless, of course, they have computers in them and run Windows. But we're focused on electric, gas, and water markets and applications across the enterprise with the entire audience. And our audience for this publication is upper and middle level managers and staff of utilities that are looking for specifically for automation solutions, not only for today, but especially for tomorrow. And our objectives are to support these education and innovation goals by providing how-to, or what I call pragmatic articles, in other words, how to do things, because that's what a lot of these people really need. Focused on forward-facing information, not the case history model. Providing a way for utilities to improve their flexibility and their mobility. And lastly, but not least important, is enriching the reader experience. Some of the things that we can do with an all-digital publication, such as embedded audio and video, animation, and other features, are not just there to be cute or fancy. As we get further and further away as human beings from one another, through the virtual world that we all increasingly live in, whether it's on the internet or Facebook or any of other social media or whatever, or just sitting, as a lot of our kids do, sit on the sofa next to each other and text back and forth. We're losing the human touch, and that's potentially a tragedy that we do not want to have prevail, because at the end of the day, we're all humans and we all need that human interaction. So by adding things like, for example, instead of an article that you just read, being able to see a video clip of maybe a customer in the field explaining how or why this particular solution worked for them or how it saved them money. I'm not talking about feature-length movies here. I'm talking about just short clips to help give it some human factor as part of the delivery. Sound, likewise, is also an intention getter, and it gives us a way, again, to add that human element into the equation of journalism. So the magazine itself, we have a series of, we're a little bit different than a lot of magazines. We have a series of very standardized features that are populated by a combination of internal and external editorial contributions. Our news feature is called Automation Rising because that's what it's really all about. As a quarterly, we're not on the cutting edge of news, so the kind of news that you'll find in Utility Horizons is going to be, frankly, news that has a fairly long shelf life, you know, things like appointments and contract awards and things like that. We're not a breaking news type publication. There's plenty of people that do that and do it well. We also have advertising and promotion content, of course, but the features are really the nuts and bolts of the publication. The Q is my editorial column. Focal point is our cover story, and I think that if you take a look at the Q2 issue that just hit the streets today, our cover story is with EPCOR, which is a combined water and power utility up in Edmonton, Alberta. And if you're not familiar with EPCOR, it's an incredibly progressive and forward-thinking utility that's been doing this since well before it became fashionable. It's the longest cover story we've run so far in 3 issues. It spans about 8 or 9 pages. And quite frankly, the one reason it's long is because it can be, because again, in a digital publication, we don't have to trim editorial down to fit a box or a number of pages, or what's called in the publishing industry a folio of X number of pages. So we can allocate whatever space is needed to tell the full story. And when I got the editorial back from them and I realized it was over 4,000 words, my first instinct was to say, well, okay, let's see what we can cut out of this. And when I read through it, it was so well written and so thorough and so multifaceted that I just didn't have the heart to edit it down. So it's there in all of its radiant glory, so I hope you'll take some time to read it. There's a lot of good information in there. Inside Tracks is an interview series where, again, we interview people in the industry that are kind of the movers and the shakers, so you can get inside their head and find out where they think the industry is going and where they have usually a pretty strong hand in making it go. The bleeding edge, and you'll notice the spelling here is B-L-E-A-D-I-N-G, not B-L-E-E-D, but it's a combination of bleeding and leading, obviously. And the reason we chose that is because this is the forward-facing flavor that we really wanted Utility Horizons to have. This is where we talk about what comes next. This is where we cater to Michael Nigley's desire about what are you going to do for me next year. Again, we have and you'll see in a few minutes here, we have a very well-rounded and deeply and broadly experienced editorial advisory board. We know the difference between what's real and what's somebody's fantasy, so you're not going to read about stuff in Utility Horizons that's never going to come to fruition. But we do feel as though there's a distinct need to have a publication out there, again, in keeping with its role of a transitional market, to tell the marketplace about what's coming next. Education matters, standard bearings, and regulation de rigueur. Those are just what they sound like. Education is about education and training. Standard bearings is about standardization and embracing standards. And regulation de rigueur talks about the regulatory dimension, which, you know, being an engineer and a technologist and being involved in this market for as long as I have, for many of the years that I've been involved, I used to kind of think, or I guess I drank the Kool-Aid, the technology drives the market. not true. As much as I'd like that to be the case, the reality is that for the most part, regulation and legislation is really what causes major shifts and changes in markets. And anybody who doesn't think so, all you got to do is take a look around at what's happened with renewables and so forth in the last 6 or 7 years, and it'll give you a pretty good indicator. If you dig down, that didn't come from the technology aspect. Solar's been around for a long time. Wind's been around for a long time. It took a legislative and, in many cases, a yet-to-be-developed regulatory process to not only encourage those things, but also provide a rate basis and an ROI and so forth for everybody to get what they need out of this in a fair and equitable way. On the horizon is a research-based feature that we take generally available research from various organizations and give you some insights into what the researchers and what the market analysts and the thought leaders think, where they think the markets are going. Intersections talks about the intersection of electric, gas, and water automation IT. Purviews is a guest editorial that if you'd like to express your views, we're always open to that. Loose ends is what we call a section is just that, wrapping up loose ends, and usually it involves a book review. So if you read a particularly good book lately about automation IT in the utility space, we'd love to have you review it and submit that for consideration. There's other things as well. And then, in terms of enriching the reader experience, embedded audio and video, animation, special effects, we can also, one of the nice things is if you look at Utility Horizons Quarterly, you'll see that it looks like a magazine. It doesn't look like a website. And that was a very deliberate requirement of mine, is that I didn't want to publish something that you had to kind of know what you were looking for to find information and news. So it looks just like a regular magazine, only better, of course. But the portability of it, the ability to be able to carry it around with you, the ability to access it wherever you are, wherever you go, I think has huge benefits for us in our increasingly mobile society. I mentioned our editorial advisory board. I'm not going to go through all these individually, but I think many of you will recognize some of the names here. These are all people who've been around the block a few times, actually way more than a few times. They're all people that I've known and in some cases been closely acquainted with and worked with. In other cases, just people that I know and respect and have come to know and respect over the many years I've been involved. So I'm very proud of who we have on our advisory panels and from an editorial standpoint. The Utility Horizons Symposium, which will make its debut in January of next year, is, again, it's focused exclusively almost on these two repetitive factors: education, because utilities are losing their most experienced employees, and because the infrastructure is reaching the end of its useful life. And we have this dilemma that we talked about earlier about how do we get these people up to speed fast enough for them to be effective and to be able to do what they need to do in the years ahead. Innovation, because everybody agrees that technology, in fact, Michael Nigley also mentioned this in his speech, is that technology is moving at the fastest pace it ever has, and utilities need to react to that and respond to that and embrace it. And they really do need to reinvent themselves if they're going to survive and prosper in the years ahead. Automation is destined to play a vital and increasing role in this transformation. I don't think that's a revelation. I think that's a given. This piece on the right here is really, it's an ad that actually appears in the Q2 issue of the magazine. I know it's not readable on here, but take a look at the magazine. You can read all about it. The theme and the sort of tagline for the event is education, innovation, automation, and all that jazz. And what I want to do here in the next few minutes is just give you an idea of how all of what we've talked about up until now sort of comes together from a practical standpoint, sort of where the rubber meets the road sort of approach in terms of how is this going to change the complexion and complexity and personality and character of utilities in the future. That's centered around this idea of balancing human capital with infrastructure optimization through automation. I realize that's a mouthful, but I'm going to explain to you exactly what that means. But essentially, these are the same things that we've been talking about up until now. I won't go back over them again, but we're going to look at that in more detail. Just to give you an idea of how this symposium will run, it is a symposium. symposium. It's not a trade show. There's no exhibits per se. This is intended to provide education on one side of the event, so there's an education track, and on the other side, which runs in parallel with it for the first 2 days, there's an innovation track. So the idea is that the people in need of education, there's 2 education sessions in the first half of each day, of day 1 and day 2, which will be a Tuesday and a Wednesday, and there will be 2 innovation sessions in the morning, and then that's repeated in the afternoon. Basically, the morning education sessions are entry-level and intermediate-level training that apply without regard to market vertical. The afternoon sessions will be more advanced, and those in most cases will be specific to a market vertical, electric, gas, water, or in some cases combinations, but that's the way we're handling that. On the innovation session side, there's no call for papers for this. There won't be any individual presentations, no death by PowerPoint once I'm done here today. The idea here is that we've all attended conferences. I've attended literally hundreds over my career, and I've kind of gotten tired of sitting in a room with 35 or 40 of my closest friends being talked to by a person who very often I've heard speak before. The theme is generally the same, the topics are the same, the information is the same, and you know, you get 5 minutes at the end to talk about it. I find personally that the most rewarding sessions that I've been involved with have been the ones that have been the most interactive, typically panel sessions and roundtable sessions. So 100% of our innovation sessions are panels, roundtables, or something of that sort, but our definition of a panel is not 3 people instead of 1 person giving a presentation. It's actually a panel or a roundtable that consists of experts at the front of the room, if you will, and people in the audience who are really wanting to know more and discuss openly what is coming next, how do we deal with it, how do we prepare for it, how do we budget for it, what are the pitfalls, what are the upsides, all those kinds of things. So every one of these 90-minute sessions on the innovation track, which is the right-hand side here of the first 2 days, will be 100% interactive. We'll have a short period at the beginning of each session to introduce the panelists, and after that, it's open for, we'll have some prepared questions. Our committees, which you'll see in a minute, will be involved with preparing the topics and actually inviting the people. If you would like to be involved in one of these panel sessions, you're more than welcome to contact us. We'll be happy to consider you. There's networking sessions at the end of the first and second day. These are the typical, you know, wine and cheese, meet and greet kind of thing, give you a chance to mingle. During the day, the majority of the newer people, the newbies as I call them, will be in the education sessions. The more senior people will most likely be both involved in sitting on the panels and roundtables as well as attending. The audience that's intended and targeted for that are senior utility executives that really need, the Michael Nigleys that need to know what comes next and be able to hear that from people who have 20, 30, 40 years of experience and have a pretty good idea of what is going to come next, what it's going to look like, how it's going to behave, what it's going to cost, and so forth. I'm going to talk to you in a minute about the scholarship program that we have for the education side, but before we get to that, the third day is a half day, and it was designed that way so that people can leave and hopefully get back home to their families without spending another night in a hotel room. The entire half day comprises 6 plenary sessions. These will be on topics like microgrids, cybersecurity, things that pertain across the boards for utilities and so forth, and their people. And the students that are part of the scholarship program, they will also have a full registration included in the scholarship, which will allow them, if they want to stay over to the half day and sit in on the plenary sessions, they can also do that. On the evenings of the first and second full day, however, back to day 1 and day 2, we're having what's called education and innovation suites. These are a very small number, there will only be 6 of them, and they're frankly reserved for our premier and elite sponsors, but not for the purpose of giving them an opportunity to spoon feed vendor-specific information. The idea, again, from an education innovation standpoint, I really kind of stole this idea from an IEEE event that's been rescinded for many years now, but for those of you who've been around for a while, You might remember the PICA conference. It was Power Industry Computer Applications Conference. It was held every 2.5 years until about, I don't know, like 1997 or 98 or something like that. Anyway, what really impressed me about those PICA conferences was even though that conference did have a big exhibit hall, in the evenings, what we usually call hospitality suites were not staffed so much by sales and business development people as they were staffed by people, because that was, you know, kind of what we commonly call an egghead conference. It was advanced network applications for energy management systems for utilities, so lots and lots of PhDs and so forth, lots of technical jargon. And you could go into these hospitality suites in the evenings and really sort of get it from the horse's mouth about what was coming next. So when I started thinking about, you know, how we were going to put together this program, that was something that jumped out as something that I definitely wanted to include here. So these E&I suites will be open in the evenings of the first couple of days, give you a chance to go in and actually talk to some of the R&D and the technical development people and so forth from the powerhouses in the industry, to be able to literally get, you know, some straight talk, get your questions answered, get your ideas vetted and so forth about, you know, what happens, you know, tomorrow, next week, next year, 3 to 5 years from now. And all of our sponsors that'll be hosting these will be directly instructed that these are to be technology exchange, and, you know, with a little bit of wine and cheese thrown in, of course. But the primary idea is an exchange of ideas and concepts and new ideas and again, forward-facing technology solutions.
Mike, if you could just wrap it up in the next couple of minutes so that we can get into the Q&A.
Sure. Okay, so I said I was going to talk a little bit about this balancing infrastructure and human capital through automation. This is a graph, and we'll go through this quickly, but basically this is kind of what things look like right now. If you look at the spectrum of automation, starting from entry-level automation systems over on the left side and advanced technology systems, subsystems, and devices on the right side, we have a big pool of people right now in the middle and on the fringes. In other words, below a certain level, you've got some manual tasks that have to be done. Above a certain level, you have some things that are they just require human involvement. They're either too advanced or they're too nebulous or too diverse to be able to be neatly tucked under an automation system. But the big issue is this pool of people in the middle, and this pool is shrinking. So if we go to the next slide here, what you really want to do with automation is you'd like to be able to reach down further with automation systems to take up some of the sort of mundane stuff that people are doing now. On the higher end, be able to, I don't know, Irfan, can you see my cursor on this, or do I need a marker for this?
I'm not seeing a cursor, but just refer to the graphic, and that'll be fine.
Okay, yeah, I've got a pointer here now. So anyway, this is what I'm talking about, is this area here, which is at the higher end where we have more advanced capability. But the main thing that we want to really try to do here is in this middle section is to be able to bring down, well, not be able to bring down, we're losing the human capital under this area here. So what we really want to wind up with is in the future, we want to be able to fill in the areas that were previously, that are being vacated by retiring veterans both at the low end and at the upper end of the spectrum. And there's examples listed here of, you know, the different types of automation, to where now this cone that's in the cost column here is shrunk considerably because the people have vanished. And that is being replaced or displaced by either entry-level automation or advanced-level automation. We have both an education advisory committee and an innovation advisory committee, and those people are listed separately, which we'll see in a minute. But just quickly on the scholarship program, I just wanted to get this across, is that this is a program that's available to utility personnel only. It has to be validated. The application has to be validated by the utilities HR department. It includes a full registration all 3 days of the conference if you want to stay for all 3 days for the education and the innovation sessions. It includes full tuition for 2 full days of education. It includes 2 paid hotel nights, which is essentially day 0, which is the arrival night, and then the 2 full days of training and education. And then you have, if you're a student and you want to come to this, then if you want to stay for the 3rd day, then the 3rd hotel night is on you, as well as your transportation back and forth to the conference in either case, which is, fairly nominal. The linkage between sponsors and students as far as this the scholarship pool goes, the funding comes from our sponsors. It goes into a blind pool, and scholarships are awarded basically on a chronological basis to whenever to the people that apply first. So this is probably, excuse me, the closest thing we have to a call for papers, only it'll be a call for scholarship applications. We've already gone through this, so I'm not going to rehash this. There's a couple links here that you can get to if you'd like to contribute. And we are at the Q&A section. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Irfan. Irfan, are you there?
Thank you very much, Mike. At this point, the presenter ball back to myself, and I'm going to upload your contact information as we get the people on the call to pose some questions to you. So just bear with me a minute, and I will upload this slide. Should be coming momentarily. Here we go. All right, so as people put their questions on, I'd like to first thank you for this very thought-provoking presentation. And you bring up several good points that we need to reflect on as an industry. One, of course, is this gap in the workforce, and you gave some historical background on what has created it. And now we have to think of ways of filling that gap quickly because we don't have the luxury of time. A big reason why we are still not over the cliff, not the national cliff, but in this business, is because a lot of people who are seasoned professionals who've had long careers have continued to work, whether as full-time employees or they've come back as contractors in the very utilities where they were working, simply because they can't afford to retire. It's very cost prohibitive to retire at this time in this economy. So that has actually worked to our advantage that we continue to enjoy their experience. So that's not a luxury that we're going to have for very long, because according to current projections, 62% of the workforce is going to retire by the year 2020. And with that goes a lot of experience, with that goes a lot of the insight that you were talking about. So can you tell us a few ways in which utilities that are on the call could help bridge this gap quickly, because we don't have, as I said, the luxury of time?
Do I still have an open mic here?
Yes.
Okay. Well, one way is to stay engaged. I think that, as I mentioned briefly, we have a tendency, and I know that a lot of people we speak to through our research and so forth, I find people telling me, like, I don't need to go to a conference, or I don't need to go to a seminar, I don't need to go to this or to that, because I can find anything I need on the internet. That just simply is not true. So in terms of bridging the gap, this needs to not be an either-or type of an expedition. It needs to be a both and or everything and. You need to avail yourself of every possible opportunity to learn and broaden your horizons in terms of where the marketplace is going. I'm really fearful to a large degree that so many people seem to think that the internet has everything. It's kind of like taking the place of what television used to be in the earlier years of, well, I can find out whatever I need to know on the 6 o'clock news. We live in a very complex world, and because of the rapid transitions taking place, especially technologically in our industry, everybody rightfully should feel like they're drinking from a fire hose, because that is what's happening. So that's probably the main piece of advice I would give, is to try to avail yourself of every possible news source, information source. I realize that no one has unlimited budgets. You can't possibly go to every conference or event that's taking place in the industry, but there's some good stuff out there, and And I think that there's, always something to be gained. One of the things that I've observed over time is that when I always take my own little straw poll when I go to events, regardless of what market or market vertical they happen to be in, and I ask people what they think about the conference or the event. And I find that I guess this is just the nature of our society, is that people tend to measure everything quantitatively. Like, all they look at is, well, how many people are here? How many people came to my booth? Or how many people were in the session? What's really important is the quality, not the quantity. And when I ask people, I say, when they say, well, we would like to have more people here, I say, well, did you have any good experiences? Did you get any good information? Oh, yeah, we found out some great stuff. And if it's a supplier, yeah, we found out about some projects we wouldn't have known about. To which my question is always, so what's your problem again? What is it that you expect from this? And again, nobody has all the answers. No researcher or no consultant. I mean, we find things in our market research side that we're not great at everything. I think we know where our sweet spot is. We're able to provide. We're 100% focused, like the magazine and the conference. Infometrics is 100% focused on utility automation and IT. That's something we really know about. We've been doing it 11 and a half years. We have a database of more than 47,000 projects. And, it's like we know what we're good at, but we also know what we don't know. And there's always room for growth in that respect.
Now, you talked about education and innovation as this dual theme, and you have it in your symposium. What about bringing in the concept of innovation in education so that as people are learning, their ability to create information is also being developed?
Well, Irfan, you're on my education committee, so I'll look to you for that. For that, not exclusively, but as part of the ingredient for that. Yes, there's. In fact, it's interesting because the gentleman who's the chairman of our education committee, Dr. Bill Craddock, is actually a retired Entergy customer services director from Entergy Arkansas Nuclear. And Bill has been a consultant for over a decade since he retired. And one of the first things that he suggested to me when I first bounced this idea off him of wanting to do something heavily education-oriented at this event, he told me a couple of things right up front. He was the person who said, make sure you get the HR department of the utilities to sign off on this so you eliminate the boondoggle factor. But the other thing that he said that I thought was very significant, and we're kind of working behind the scenes here to figure out really how to do this, is he said, he says, you're not going to serve this market. He said, and I explained to him about why I felt this was needed because of the aging workforce issue and so forth. He said, well, you're not going to service this entire industry with one small conference once a year. He said, if you're going to be successful with this, you have to figure out a way to either syndicate this or do something. So we're exploring opportunities and relationships actually with several other individuals and organizations that are already engaged in providing utility training. What we're really focused on here, though, is quite unique and innovative, I think, in and of itself. If you look at the industry organizations and associations, the professional associations like IEEE, ISA, IEC, and so forth, there's any quantity of training you might want, either at what I call the bits and bytes level, in other words, how do things work, how does IEC 61850 work on a protocol layer standpoint and so forth, or the other end of the spectrum is the industry level, which is training courses for power engineering, hydraulics, if you're in the water, oil, and gas side of the industry, things like substation automation for non-utility executive or non-technical executives and so forth. There's all kinds of training. What's missing is this part that I talked about earlier on, which is the part where it's actually the hands-on part of actually running a project. How do you design, plan, specify, develop an RFP, interact with potential suppliers, make sure your project stays on track and on schedule and on budget, know what you're in for and supporting it once the project is completed and installed. That kind of training, a lot of these people have completely missed out and are still going to completely miss out on having enough overlap time with the people that they're replacing for that brain trust to be conveyed to them. And even though there's been just enormous amounts written and presented about the whole aging workforce issue. I'm sorry to tell you that our experience and our survey and our research work suggests that there's very little in the way of proactive programs. In other words, everybody's giving it massive lip service, but in terms of actual programs to be able to capture this brain trust before it goes out the door, I could count on my two hands the number of utilities that I know of out of the more than 3,000 across the country that actually have any kind of formal program to do that. And the results is showing. The people that we talk to are telling us, I don't know how to do this. I've never done it before, and there's nobody here to tell me. They literally ask us if there's a book they can read or go to the library and get, or a course they can go to. So what we're trying to do is to fill that need. Now, the innovative part of that is that we are providing both the practical and pragmatic element that's missing from these other organizations, but also we're looking at taking those courses and ultimately providing them either as podcasts or some other type of mechanism, and we haven't selected the technology or the vehicle, so to speak, for that yet. But our intention is to be able to provide this on an ongoing basis year-round. Now, that might turn into a combination of podcasts or canned recorded sessions in combination with other training that's put on throughout the year at various locations around the country. So we haven't worked all that out yet, but Irfan and I and the other members of the education faculty will be discussing that more in the future.
Great. Let's take a couple of these questions that have come online. Well, one is more like a comment, but it's in the form of a question. Michael Shea says, isn't the summary of attributes of newbies and veterans a perfect summary for IT versus OT? Mike?
I hadn't thought about it that way, but I guess in a way that's true, although, not all of the IT people are veterans and neither are all of the OT people. I mean, I think you have that subdivision on both sides of the utility, but, what's happening in utilities as far as the information technology and the operations technology side of the enterprise, every utility is a little bit different. There's certainly been a pervasive trend that we've seen for a number of years now toward trying to merge those organizations. And what we find is that in some utilities, the IT people come out on top and they kind of rule the roost and decide the direction. In other cases, we see where the operations people wind up coming out on top. When I say on top, what I mean is managerially speaking in terms of who gets to set the direction for the utility. And, I've seen it work good in both ways, and I've seen it work disastrously in both ways. The IT people have a certain mindset. In fact, a friend of mine at Entergy told me years ago, he said, when I look, and I'll never forget this, he said, here we are, and he's an operations guy. He said, here we are running the, mission critical operations of substations all over the South and Southeast. This is Entergy. Operating over lines that you wouldn't be satisfied to surf the internet in your living room on. What he was alluding to was the fact that today, still, most of the large SCADA EMS systems are still operating over voice-grade circuits with 12, 2400 baud. If you've got 9600 baud, you've got a Cadillac. How would you like to have to surf the internet at 12 or 2400 or even 9600 baud or bits per second? Nobody would sit still for that as a consumer, and yet that's the way our critical infrastructure is being run. Electric, gas, water, transportation, telecom, you name it. They're all in the same boat. Yeah, we're chipping away at it, but the vast majority of what's out there is still operating. What this friend of mine told me was he said, on the one hand, I look at the IT people that is we're merging the IT and the OT operations in our utility. What I'm hearing is that, they have the Cadillac pipes, in other words, fiber to everything. He said, I would kill to have that kind of communications connectivity. He said, but at the same time, it scares me to death because their idea of urgency is running payroll on Friday, and they have no concept of what a real-time systems needs are. And I've had some personal experiences with the mergers of IT and OT that have been occasionally on the borderline of catastrophic. So there's certainly, issues and realities there that have to be overcome. But it's also an inevitability, and I think that overall it's a healthy trend and it's part of this broadening of knowledge, experience, and education that, pretty much these days to be a utility technical guy or gal, you really need to know at least a little bit about everything. And I think that blurring of the lines between IT and OT is long-term a good thing, even though I realize those of you that are in utilities, it may have its pain points occasionally.
Okay, we'll try to keep our responses a little brief because I've got 3 questions and 9 minutes left. All right, the next question is from William Miller, who says, you have the opportunity to drive the change. Are you going to address the U.S. legal aspects and do comparison with other countries who do not have these constraints? Are you going to push renewables such that more incentives are offered like in California?
Okay, if we're talking about the publication and or the event, first of all, it's not our role to push anything. Our role is to report on what's happening. We don't have any preconceived notions about what direction the utility industry should go. Again, there's where you cross over from reporting news and information to reporting opinions. I have an editorial column in the Q where I freely express my opinions, but that's not the mainstream of what the magazine is all about.
Okay.
I think that's all I can say about that, really.
Next question, it says, Elizabeth Vandenberg asks, with Mike's focus on automation, how does he see customers fitting into his future framework?
That's a good question. We've spent so much time in this industry over the last couple of years with, empowering/engaging consumers. I have a prediction that's maybe controversial, but I really believe that this is what's going to happen, is we've spent a lot of time, money, and resources trying to engage what amounts to the boomer generation, which I'll remind you is the generation of VCRs flashing 12 o'clock, even though we'd like to think of ourselves as being pretty technically astute. Again, I'm a technical person, but, my VCR was flashing 12 o'clock too. What I predict is going to happen is that very soon, the next couple of years, as you start to see the Gen X and Y and so forth, the millennials become the market mainstream, we're going to change from having an industry where we're begging and pleading with consumers to get engaged technologically and interactively to one where they're standing on the desk of the CEO at the utility saying, where the hell is it? I think we're about to undergo a huge shift in this industry and in society, at least in the developed part of the world, with that major change of consumers. Because as these consumers come into the market mainstream, as I said earlier, they were raised with technology. They just expect it to be there. You're not going to have to plead or beg with anybody.
Yeah. Next question is from Pat Duggan, who asks, how do we get past the blinders and rose-colored glasses and get the technical issues that need to be addressed into both the educational institutions and our industry dialogue?
Well, part of that, ironically, is going to be solved by the retirement issue. Even though there's a lot of bright people in the baby boom generation, in our surveys, we've heard people that will tell us things like, very accommodatingly say, well, I'm not going to engage in that particular project or that upgrade or that expansion or replacement because I don't want to make a decision for somebody else that's going to have to live with my decision. That's a good thing. That's healthy. By the same token, we've literally gotten a lot of people who will tell us, well, you know what? I retire at the end of the year. I don't really care what they do after this. I've done what I need to do. I'm not about to learn something new at this stage of the game. So we've had both of those extremes, everything in the middle. But I think that the way that's going to be handled is going to be sort of an implicit part of this major shift in who makes up the utility staff and so forth at utilities, and how those decisions are made is going to change dramatically based on the people making them, and they're going to be a lot younger, a lot more tech savvy, a lot more open to new things, and also I'll also mention that they also tend to be very much more business oriented, ROI oriented, and so forth. So I think we're in for a pretty major shift in that regard.
Related question, Michael Shea says, how would one who's been operating inside a box to become comfortable with thinking and operating outside the box?
Some people can't do that. there's a lot of people who are not going to be able to make that transition. And again, I go back to the retirement and the purging of the workforce. That's not something that my personal belief is that I don't think you learn to be an outside-the-box thinker. I think you either are or you're not. And there's a certain element of the workforce that's always going to have that purview, and there's a certain element that isn't. I don't expect that to change dramatically, but I don't think that if somebody who's literally looking to make the transition, I think that's healthy. And somebody who wants to make it probably can, but you can't convince somebody to be an out-of-the-box thinker. I don't believe.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike Marullo, for your presentation and your interaction with the audience on the Q&A. Going forward, the NIST Interoperability Roadmap Project identified some 21 stakeholder groups. This is a very wide community of different people with different interests. There's a lot going on in our industry, and a person can get completely overwhelmed by the number of conferences, workshops, panel discussions, and all the deluge of emails that keep going back and forth with announcements about development. In this business, it is very important for each key stakeholder to know what their skill sets are, decide what their goal will be as a contribution in the industry, and then intelligently look for resources that can support their endeavor. We're trying to do that through the Smart Grid Educational Series by bringing subject matter experts from a variety of these stakeholder groups to tell you what is important to them. And just like you see people from American literature telling you how to write a good composition, Edgar Allan Poe told us that you have to try various methods until you find your own method. And I feel that in this business, we have a very similar goal. So what we need to do is turn ourselves from a scalar into a vector, so we have both magnitude and direction, because then only will we make progress. Innovation is something that needs to be built into each one of us. We should be constantly looking for new ways of doing things. Then collectively, our industry will be innovative. So I will continue making my effort through the Smart Grid Educational Series to bring insightful thinkers and presenters like Mike Marullo and others that you've seen in the past. I would hope that you will continue to contribute in the industry and keep participating in forums like this. Our next event is going to be on Tuesday, July 9th from the IBM Innovation Center. As soon as I have my speaker confirmed, I will communicate it to all of you. So at this time, I would like to thank all of you for participating in the session today and asking your questions, and I hope that this was instructive. Enjoy your afternoon, and we will connect very soon. Thank you very much. At this time, the recording is going to be stopped.